Commander Silthera stood at the window of her warship and looked down at the human colony below them in space, and her dragon Lirin was beside her with scales that shined like black glass under the starlight, and the dragon was huge and powerful. But right now she seemed worried about something, and Silthera could feel it through their special bond that connected their minds. Altogether, since 200 years ago when they first met and became partners for life, the colony was called New Haven. And it sat on a small moon that orbited a gas giant planet, and there were only 12,000 humans living there in small domes, where they grew food and mined ice from the frozen surface, and they had no real weapons or defenses that could stop even one warship, and yet the Aureli's empire had sent 1,000 ships to make them surrender and join the empire like 40. 7 other star systems had done before them. Thera had silver hair that reached down to her waist and violet-colored eyes that could see in the dark, and her pointed ears showed she was one of the elf people who ruled the empire for 3,000 years, and she wore the black uniform of an imperial commander, with silver marks that showed her rank in behind her. The ship hummed with power as the crew prepared for what would come next. Admiral Corvith appeared on the screen in front of her, and his face was stern and serious like always, and he had scars on his pointed ears from many battles he had fought before, and his silver uniform was perfect, without any wrinkles or marks on it, and he looked at Silthera with eyes that expected her to follow orders without question or doubt, though. Admiral spoke, and his voice came through clear and strong, and he said the fleet would move into attack position in 6 hours, and the humans had been given their final warning to surrender or face complete destruction. And then he asked if there was any response from the colony below, and Silthera told him they were sending one person to talk and negotiate. The person was a woman named Kate Morgan, and she wanted to meet on Silthera's ship, and the Admiral seemed amused by this, because one unarmed human coming to talk while 1,000 warships surrounded her home seemed either very brave or very foolish, and he gave permission for Silthera to receive the human diplomat, and then his image disappeared from the screen. Silthera walked to the docking bay with Lirin, following close behind, and the dragon's claws clicked on the metal floor, and her wings were folded tight against her body because the corridors were not made for creatures as large as dragons, but Lirin could sense things that others could not, and right now she was sending feelings of unease and worry through the bond they shared. The human shuttle arrived and docked with a soft hiss of air, and the door opened slowly, and Kate Morgan stepped through into the bay, and she was younger than Silthera expected, with red-brown hair tied back in a simple braid, and she wore a basic flight suit with no weapons or armor or any kind of protection, and her green eyes looked at the dragon without any fear at all, and then she looked at Silthera with something that seemed almost like sadness or pity. Kate spoke, and her voice was calm and steady, and she thanked Silthera for agreeing to meet, and then she said something that made no sense at all, because she said she was there to offer the Empire a chance to leave and take all their ships away and go back home before something bad happened. Silthera almost laughed because the idea was so ridiculous, and she pointed out that there were 1,000 warships outside the colony, and each one could turn the moon into dust and ashes in minutes, and yet this one human was telling them to leave like they were the ones in danger instead of the colonists, who had no way to defend themselves. Kate nodded and said she understood about the 1,000 ships, and she knew the Empire had conquered 47 systems using the same method of bringing overwhelming force that no one could resist, and she said, the Empire, it's not evil or cruel, but just followed orders and used military power to expand and grow. But then she said something strange about how the Empire had never faced real resistance. Before, Silthera asked what resistance could come from farmers and miners with no weapons, and Kate reached into her pocket slowly and pulled out a small data chip that was no bigger than her thumb, and she held it up and said this chip contained one message that would reach Earth if she activated it, and that would change everything that was about to happen. The elf commander said Kate was lying and making up stories to scare them, but there was doubt in her voice because something about the way the human spoke made it seem like she was telling the truth, and Kate's face stayed calm and serious, and she began to explain something that Silthera had never heard before. She said that 40 years ago, humanity had fought a terrible war, but not against aliens or other species in space, but against themselves, and 3 billion people died in just the first week of fighting, and when it was over, the survivors looked at all the weapons they had built and all the ships and terrible machines of destruction, and they made a choice that seemed crazy. They decided to hide everything and pretend to be weak, and they sent colony ships full of farmers and miners and peaceful people out to the stars, and they acted like they had no military power at all, and they let other species think humans were simple and harmless and not a threat to anyone, but the whole time they kept the weapons and the fleets hidden away in case someone made the mistake of thinking weakness was real. Kate stepped closer, and Liren growled deep in her throat, but the human did not stop or show any fear, and she said humanity had hoped they would never need those weapons again, because every time they used them, it reminded them of what they were capable of doing to each other and to anyone else who pushed them to Farsalthara's hand moved toward her weapon on her belt, and she asked why humanity would hide such power. If they really had it, and Kate's face showed real sadness when she answered, and she said it was because they hoped the galaxy could be peaceful, and they did not want to be the monsters they had been during the war with themselves. The elf commander laughed, but it was a bitter sound without real humor, and she said Admiral Korvath would never order the fleet to leave based on threats from one unarmed human, and Kate had failed in her mission to save the colony. And there was nothing more to... Kate's shoulders dropped a little, and she pressed her thumb against the data chip, and it glowed with blue light for just a second. And she said she was sorry for what would happen next, and the message shot away through space faster than any ship could follow, and Silthera's computers tried to track where it went, and the answer came back showing it was heading toward Earth, which was 26 light-years away from where they were. Nezelthora pointed out that even if a human fleet existed somewhere, it would take weeks for them to arrive at the colony, and by then the battle would be long over, and the colonists would have surrendered or been destroyed, and there was no way they could reach them in time to make any difference. Kate looked at her with eyes that were completely certain and unafraid, and she said Silthera should ask herself why humans would build a colony exactly 26 light-years from Earth in this specific star system along this particular trade route. And she said the colony was not the target of the trap, but the bait, and the Empire had already been there for 3 days, which was more than enough. Time understanding hit Silthera like a physical blow, and her hand flew to her command console, and she started to order a tactical scan of all space around them at maximum range, and she told them to look for anything hiding behind the gas giant or in the sensor shadows, where ships could wait without being detected. The alarm sirens started screaming before she finished giving the order, and her display filled with red markers, showing hundreds and then thousands of contacts appearing from where they had been hiding behind the huge gas giant planet, and they were ships unlike anything in the Empire's databases with angular designs and covered in weapons that looked far more advanced than what the elves used. The front of the human fleet was a ship so massive it made even the largest elf warship look small, and its hull was covered in scars from battles Silthera could not imagine, and across the front in huge letters that seemed to burn with challenge was painted the name. Defiance. Admiral Korvath's face appeared on every screen, and his calm composure was finally broken, and he ordered all ships to battle stations, and he started to ask Silthera what was happening, but the transmission cut off suddenly when another signal took over every communication channel in the entire elf fleet. A woman's voice came through, and it was old and hard like steel that had been tested many times, and she said this was Fleet Admiral Lisa Martinez of the Terran Defense Force, and the elf ships were in violation of human territory, and they had one chance to surrender by dropping shields and powering down weapons and preparing to be boarded, and any refusal would be considered an act of war. Silthera looked at Kate, who stood calmly while chaos erupted all around them, and the elf asked how the humans had been called, and Kate said she had not called them at all, but only activated a beacon, and the truth was the human fleet had been watching and waiting since the moment the elf ships first arrived 3 days earlier. Through her bonds, Silthera felt Lorraine's fear, and it was raw and primal, and the dragon who had faced down armies was terrified of what she sensed in those human ships, and ancient instincts were screaming that these were not prey, but apex predators who were Admiral Corvith did not choose to surrender to the humans, and Silthera watched from her ship as the flagship. Sovereign Dawn broke away from the formation, and its engines burned. Bright as they pushed the massive vessel forward in the admirals, the voice came across all communication channels calling for the fleet to rally and show these humans. The true might of the Aureli's empire, and 50 warships followed his command because their crews were loyal to him even. Unto death Kate Morgan stood beside Silthera at the observation window, and her earlier calm had been replaced by something sadder, and she said the admiral was going to get all those people killed for no good reason. And Silthera wanted to believe the humans might be bluffing about their power, but she knew deep down that was not true, because Liren pressed against her side, and the dragon's confidence was completely shattered by what she sensed from the human.
Oh.
Ships through their bond, Silthera felt what the dragon felt, and it was ancient prey instincts screaming warnings, even though Nexus dragons were supposed to be the most powerful predators in all known space, and yet here, they were afraid of something that radiated wrongness and danger beyond anything they had faced before. Kate said quietly that the humans were not bluffing, but hoping they would not have to prove their power, and Silthera watched as the human fleet did not move or charge forward to meet the attacking elf ships, but simply waited with their weapons tracking every vessel with mechanical precision that never wavered or hesitated. Admiral Martinez's voice cut through the chaos one final time, and she told Admiral Corveth to stand down and said this was his final warning. But the elf admiral roared back about fighting for the Empire and ordered all weapons to fire at once. 50 elf warships opened fire together, and it was a display of destructive power that would have reduced an entire planet to burning rubble and plasma. Beams and quantum torpedoes and mass driver rounds streaked across the empty space between the two fleets, and it was the kind of firepower that had broken every resistance the Empire had ever encountered. The human fleet's defensive systems came alive, and Silthera had seen the best defensive technology in 5 different galaxies, including impregnable shields and adaptive armor and temporal displacement fields, but none of it compared to what happened next. The human weapons did not just stop or deflect the incoming fire, but made it disappear completely, and lance beams vanished in mid-flight, and torpedoes imploded before reaching their targets, and mass driver rounds simply ceased to exist, as if they had never been fired at all. And the entire devastating attack was neutralized in less than 3 seconds. Kate whispered something about quantum dissolution fields that unmade matter at the atomic level, and said humans had developed them during their civil war to stop relativistic kill vehicles, and Silthera could not speak or process what she was seeing because it should have been impossible. Human ships fired back, but they did not use missiles or energy weapons, and instead each vessel launched what looked like simple metal rods no larger than a person's arm, and Silthera's tactical computer flagged them as primitive kinetic weapons. Barely worth noting, then the rods began to accelerate, and they moved faster than anything Silthera had ever tracked, and faster than light itself should allow, and they crossed the distance between fleets in microseconds, and each one was locked onto a specific target with impossible precision, and when they struck, they carried so much kinetic energy that matter simply ceased to exist in a sphere around the impact point. The Sovereign Dawn took 3 hits at the same time, and the flagship that had led the conquest of a dozen worlds and could survive sustained fire from planetary defense grids simply vanished. And there was no explosion or debris field, and one moment it existed, and the next there was only empty space and a cloud of particles. Spreading outward, 49 more ships died in that same instant, and 49 crews with thousands of souls were gone in the time it took Silthera to draw a single breath, and she felt sick and horrified and completely unable to understand what had just happened. Kate said the words relativistic kill vehicles and explained they were tungsten rods accelerated to 99% of light speed, and each one carried the kinetic energy of a small nuclear weapon, and humans had built them to kill their own most powerful ships during the war they fought against themselves. The silence that followed was complete and absolute, and the remaining 950 elf vessels hung motionless in space with their crews paralyzed by shock and terror, because an entire battle group had been destroyed in seconds, and the human fleet had not even engaged what Kate called their main weapons, Admiral Martinez's voice returned, and it was softer now, but somehow more terrible, and she said, Admiral Corveth was dead along with his crew because he believed the Empire's propaganda about being invincible. And she told the remaining ships not to make her kill anyone else and to stand down immediately. Selether found her voice, though it came out rough and broken, and she opened a channel to all remaining fleet commanders and ordered them to power down weapons and drop shields because it was over and they had lost one. Captain tried to argue, and Silthera shouted at him, asking if he had not just seen 50 of their best ships destroyed like they were nothing, and she said they were not fighting an enemy fleet but a technological advantage. They could not comprehend, and if they did not stand down immediately, they would all die like Corveth had died one by one. The elf warships complied with her orders, and shields fell and weapons powered down, and the great fleet of the Aureli's Empire became nothing more than prisoners waiting to see if their captors would show mercy, though. Human ships moved forward and surrounded the elf vessels in a formation that was both protective and threatening. At the same time, and transport craft launched from the Defiance heading toward each surrendered ship, and Silthera knew they would be boarded, and their crews would be questioned, and their technology would be studied. Kate placed a hand on Silthera's shoulder in a gesture of comfort and said she was sorry the elf had to see such destruction, but now she would understand what humanity really was underneath the peaceful farmer colonies and quiet expansion into space. Hilthera whispered that humans were monsters, and Kate corrected her gently and said, no, they were survivors who had built those weapons to use against themselves and against enemies, who had the same technology and the same desperation and the same willingness to do anything. To when she explained that the Empire was powerful, but had never faced an existential threat, had never been forced to choose between extinction and becoming something terrible, and that made all the difference in how they fought. Ran made a low sound in her throat, and Silthera felt the dragon's question through their bond about what would happen to them. Now and before she could think of an answer, a new contact appeared on the display, showing a single ship breaking away from the human fleet and approaching her vessel. Kate said it was Admiral Martinez's personal craft, and the Admiral wanted to talk, and Silthera asked bitterly if it was to gloat about victory, and Kate said no, it was to explain what came next 20 minutes. Later, Silthera stood in her own conference room, facing a woman who looked to be in her 60s by human standards, and Admiral Lisa Martinez was shorter than Silthera, with dark hair that had silver streaks through it and brown skin weathered by Sithar. Years of command, and she wore a simple uniform with no fancy decorations, but her eyes held the weight of terrible knowledge. Ellerin coiled in the corner, watching the Admiral with wary respect because the dragon could sense this human had faced death many times and never flinched or backed down. Martinez spoke, and her voice was surprisingly gentle. She said she was going to tell a story about how humanity learned to stop being afraid and started being terrifying instead. She activated a display showing Earth as it must have been decades ago, and it was beautiful with blue oceans and green continents and full of life, and then the image shifted to show ships descending on cities and weapons firing and buildings collapsing. The Admiral explained that 43 years ago humans discovered they were not alone in the universe, but not through peaceful contact or radio signals, but through an attack by a species called the Creel Consortium, who decided humanity would make excellent slaves, and they sent 200 vessels to conquer Earth. Silthera felt sick looking at the images because they showed brutal destruction far worse than the clean kills she had just witnessed, and Martinez continued in that same steady voice, saying humans lost 1 billion people in the first week because they had no weapons that could touch the day, Creel ships, and no way to fight back. Shy said humans did what they always do when faced with impossible odds, and they innovated and built weapons that were never meant to exist, and took theories that should have stayed as ideas and made them into reality. The display showed construction happening in orbit, with massive shipyards being erected and weapons being assembled, and tests being conducted that left entire moons cratered and destroyed. Martinez said it took 3 years of hiding and building and dying, and then humanity struck back, and the hologram showed human ships that were crude compared to what floated outside now, but they bristled with terrible weapons, and humans did not just defeat the Creel, but obliterated them and chased them back to their homeworld and gave them the same. The throne room of the Aureli's Empire had stood for 3,000 years, and its crystal pillars were carved from the heart of a dying star. And Emperor Athras sat upon the eternal seat with his ancient features, showing none of the fury that Sothera could feel radiating from him like heat from a fire, and behind him, a dozen Nexus dragons lounged on raised platforms with their scales shimmering in colors that hurt to look at. Siltha knelt on the polished floor with Lirin coiled protectively around her, and 900 surviving captains formed ranks behind them, and they had been home for 3 days when the summons came within hours of their arrival. The Emperor spoke, and his voice was like wind through dead leaves. And he told Silthera to rise, and then asked why he should not have her executed for losing 50 ships to a species they had classified as insignificant and harmless. Silthera stood and met his gaze directly because a lesser elf would have looked away, but she had seen something that made even an emperor's anger seem manageable, and she said the classification was wrong and catastrophically. So she activated the holographic projector, and the throne room filled with images from the battle, showing the human fleet emerging from hiding, and the casual destruction of Admiral Korvat's ships, and the relativistic weapons moving faster than physics should allow. And Emperor Athras watched in silence, but Silthera saw his fingers tighten on the throne's armrests. When the display ended, the Emperor spoke to someone beyond Silthara's vision, and an elderly elf in deep blue robes stepped forward, and her expression was troubled, and she had been studying humanity's technology since the fleet returned, and examining every sensor, reading, and every piece of data they had collected. The Emperor asked for her analysis, and the artificer named Nerith said the weapons were beyond current understanding, and the kinetic weapons alone required energy generation that exceeded elf capabilities by orders of magnitude, and the defensive systems operated on principles they had theorized, but never successfully. Maidre Lotharis asked if she was saying humans were more advanced than elves, and Nerith replied carefully that humans had pursued a different path of advancement, and explained that elves had spent millennia perfecting magic and technology, fusion and dragon bonds and elegant solutions, while humans had built brutal, efficient weapons designed for one purpose, which was overwhelming force against enemies of equal power. Emperor Atharas stood, and the dragons behind him stirred, and he descended the steps to where Silthara stood, and despite being shorter than her, his presence was overwhelming, and he asked what her assessment was of the human military leadership. After speaking with their Admiral, Siltha met his eyes and said Admiral Martinez was a veteran of a war that killed billions of her own people, and she had seen humanity at its worst and commanded weapons that made it terrible, and she was hoping the Empire would be wise enough not to make her use them again. The Emperor repeated the word hoping, and said not demanding or threatening, and Silthera explained that the Admiral had already demonstrated the threat, and now she was giving them a choice. Atheris turned to address the assembled captains and said some of them were calling for immediate retaliation and a mobilization of the full Imperial Armada, with every ship and dragon and weapon at their disposal, because they believed overwhelming numbers could counter overwhelming technology. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the ranks, and Silthera saw it in their faces, which was the shame of defeat and the need to prove themselves, and they wanted revenge for Admiral Korvath and the 50 ships. Emperor said flatly that they were all fools, and the room fell completely silent. He asked Silthera how many defense fleets the humans claimed to. Haven't she answered 12 with 600 ships each? And he asked how many she had faced, and she said 1 fleet with 500 ships. Atharis walked among the captains, with his ancient eyes studying each face, and he said they had sent 1,000 ships and lost 50 in seconds, and they could send 10,000 or 100,000 and strip every system of defenses and throw their entire military might at humanity. And then he stopped and turned to face them all and said they would lose. The murmurs became protests, but Atharis raised a hand for silence and said the artificer had been analyzing human weapons and estimated that matching their defensive capabilities alone would require a century of focused research, and matching their offensive capabilities might take 2 centuries, and that assumed humans did not continue advancing during that time. He returned to his throne and settled into it with the weight of ages, and said the Aureli's empire had ruled this region of space for 3 millennia and conquered 47 systems and integrated hundreds of species, and built a civilization spanning thousands of light years through strength, yes, but also through wisdom, he said. Wisdom demanded they recognize when they had encountered something they could not defeat, and one captain called out, asking if they were surrendering and accepting this. Humiliation. Athos replied that they would adapt as they had always adapted, because any successful civilization must adapt when circumstances change, and he gestured to Silthera and asked her to repeat the exact terms the humans had offered. Stepped forward and said Admiral Martinez told them they could be neighbors or trading partners or potentially even friends, but they could never be conquerors of human space. The Emperor asked what would happen if they refused all those options and simply ignored the humans, and Silthera said then the humans would watch them, and if they threatened any colony, again they would be reminded of the consequences. Emperor Athos was silent for a long moment, with his ancient mind working through centuries of statecraft and strategy, and finally he spoke and said he would send an embassy to Earth and open diplomatic relations and negotiate borders and trade agreements and learn everything possible about these humans who chose to appear weak. One of the war captains tried to speak, but Athos cut him off and dismissed everyone except Silthera and the artificer. Nerith and the throne room emptied, leaving only them and the Emperor with his bonded dragons. When the doors sealed, Athos's manner changed, and he suddenly looked tired and ancient in a way he had never appeared before, and he asked Silthera to tell him honestly what would happen if they went to war with humanity. They'll thought of the crater on the moon and ships vanishing into clouds of particles, in Kate Morgan's sad certainty, and she said humans would win, but not before millions, or perhaps billions, died on both sides because they had weapons to destroy planets and had used them before. Athos said the key words were against themselves, and mused that a species which nearly destroyed itself in civil war and then chose to hide its weapons rather than use them to conquer was unusual. Norith added that it was terrifying because a species with no internal conflict would be predictable. But humans argued with themselves and doubted and made different choices based on incomplete information, and that made them unpredictably. This turned to study the star maps floating beside his throne, and said what the Empire would not admit publicly, which was that their expansion had been slowing because they were overextended and governing too many systems with too few resources, and adding humanity's 14 systems would have solved that problem. But now they had a border they could not cross and a neighbor they could not threaten. He asked what decisions Silthera would advise about whether to continue expanding elsewhere and risk exhausting themselves, or to consolidate and improve what they had, and accept that the era of easy conquest was over. Silthera thought about Kate Morgan and the colony of farmers protected by unimaginable weapons, and the human admiral who killed 50 ships and felt genuine regret, and a species that chose restraint when it had to be the hardest choice. She advised they learn from humans who had unlimited power and chose not to use it except in self-defense, and said maybe there was wisdom in that approach. Theris agreed maybe, or maybe humans were waiting for the Empire to grow comfortable before striking, and said trust was a luxury empires rarely could afford. Silthera suddenly said to send her as part of the embassy to let her continue observing humanity, and if they were planning something, she would see it. And if they were genuine, then maybe they could build something better than perpetual suspicion. Lyrian rumbled agreement. And Silthera felt the dragon's curiosity through their bond, because despite fear and despite what she had witnessed, the dragon wanted to understand these strange humans who had beaten them. So thoroughly Athos studied her for a long moment and asked if she trusted humans enough for that after they destroyed 50 ships, and Silthera replied that she trusted them because they destroyed only 50, when they could have obliterated the entire fleet, and that showed restraint worth learning about. The Emperor nodded slowly and said very well, and she would lead the military contingent, while the artificer would lead the scientific delegation, and he would send his youngest son, Prince Terran, to lead the diplomatic mission. He smiled in a way that was sharp and dangerous, and said, while they were learning about humanity, they would also be watching for weaknesses, because even if they sought peace, they must always be prepared for war. Asked about the rest of the Empire, because the outer systems were already talking and seeing this as weakness. and Aethera said let them talk because he had ruled for 1,000 years by being strong. The human leader, whose name was James, said civilizations grow and need resources and space and opportunities. So humanity would expand eventually, and he asked how humans measured success if not by territory, and his answer was simple, saying they measured it by whether their children inherited a better world than they did. He explained that humans nearly destroyed themselves 40 years ago and 3 billion people died because they could not control their worst impulses, and now they were trying to be better. Admiral Martinez leaned forward and said, humans were not pacifists or naive, but trying to be better while remaining ready to be worse than anyone could imagine. If forced, and that was the difficult balance they walked every day, James said quietly to show them, and Martinez hesitated, saying the council was not sure about this, but, James insisted and said the delegation came to learn truth, so let them see it. The admiral stood and gestured for everyone to follow, and they rode a transport deeper into the mountain through security checkpoints that grew more severe with each level, and Silthera noticed Liren becoming agitated with her scales rippling with unease, and whatever they were approaching made the dragons' instincts scream warnings. They entered a massive chamber carved from solid rock and spread before them in special storage berths were ships unlike anything in the orbital fleet, and these were older and scarred and radiating menace that made the vessels at New Haven look friendly by comparison. Martinez said this was Memorial fleet containing the ships they built during the war, and the ships they used to nearly destroy themselves, and she walked among them, touching holes with something like reverence mixed with horror, and said, each one represented a choice to survive at any cost. Neri approached the nearest vessel with her eyes studying its design, and she said some of these weapons did not make sense because they violated principles of physics as elves understood them. Martinez replied that they violated principles of morality too, and pointed to a ship called Rage Against Death, saying it carried weapons that could ignite a planet's atmosphere and just set the entire thing on fire, and they built it to use against their own cities if enemy forces occupied them. She moved to another ship called Remember Tomorrow and said it could manipulate localized time fields and age a ship's crew to death in seconds while leaving the vessel intact, and they used it 3 times during the war, and 3 times committed mass killing without firing a shot. Silthera felt sick and asked why they were being shown this, and James said, because they needed to understand what humanity was capable of when they stopped trying to be civilized. He explained these ships killed billions and ended the war by making continuation impossible, because everyone was too afraid of what would be done next, and then they locked them away and swore never to use them again. Turon observed that they kept them, though, and Martinez agreed, saying they kept them because the universe did not care about moral aspirations, and if someone came to destroy them or threatened their existence, these ships would fly again, and they would use them without hesitation. She turned to face the delegation directly and said the fleet at New Haven was their defensive force with modern, relatively humane ships designed to fight without excessive casualties. But these memorial ships were what they used when humane stopped being an optional area. Made a sound deep in her throat, and Silthera felt the dragon's terror through their bond, because the dragon could sense something in those ships that spoke 2 primal fears older than civilization itself. James said there was more to see, and they descended further into chambers that made Silthera wish she had never agreed to this mission, because they saw weapons that could crack planets and biological assays, agents that could sterilize worlds, and artificial intelligence that could infiltrate and destroy entire digital civilizations, and worse things that humanity had imagined in darkest hours, and then actually built. James explained they called this the Archive of Shame, where every weapon was cataloged and maintained and kept ready, but more importantly, every weapon had a memorial attached with a list of names of people who died because of it, and people who killed with it and could not live with what they had done afterward. He stopped before a simple device barely larger than Silthara's hand, and said this one was his personal nightmare, called the Cascade, and it was a self-replicating machine that could reduce any carbon-based life 2 constituent atoms, and they deployed it once in a place called Beijing during the final days of war, and 3 million people became dust. In 6 hours, his voice stayed steady, but Silthera saw his hand shaking, and he said he gave that order when He was a general and decided 3 million deaths were acceptable to prevent 300 million, and he had lived with that. Choice 4, 40-year Silthara whispered, asking why they were telling this, and why reveal worst weapons and greatest. Shamus and Martinez said because the Empire needed to understand what it was dealing with. She explained that the delegation came to assess humanity and find weaknesses and determine if they could eventually be defeated, so here was the answer, which was no, they could not be defeated, not because human weapons were better though they were, and not because tactics were superior, though they might be, but because humanity had already faced the worst enemy it ever knew. Aerith breathed the word ourselves, and James agreed, saying they had seen what humans do when there are no limits or mercy or hope, and they had been to the edge of extinction and looked over and then chosen to step back. He said that was their real strength, not the weapons, but the discipline not to use them. They returned to the conference room in silence, and Silthara felt as if she had aged a century in the past hour, and beside her, Terran was pale and even. Neri's usual curiosity was dampened by horror. Terran asked finally, what happened now after being shown they could be destroyed, and were they demanding submission? James replied, they were demanding understanding, and said the Aurelies Empire could be their neighbor or trading partner or potentially ally, but they needed to accept that humanity would never bow to anyone again because they had been conquered and fought for survival and earned independence in blood. Silthara asked what would happen if the Empire decided the risk was too great and humans were too dangerous to have as neighbors. Martinez's smile was sad, and she said then they would watch the Empire's borders very carefully and hope. The Empire was smarter than the Creel had been. Prince Terran stood drawing himself to full height and said he would report what they saw to his father, but would also tell him something else, and he looked at each human in turn. He said humanity did not show weapons to threaten them, but showed shame to teach them, and there was wisdom in that, and painful wisdom, but wisdom nonetheless. James said they hoped so because the alternative was showing what those weapons actually did, and neither side wanted that. The delegation prepared to depart. Silthara found herself alone with Admiral Martinez for a moment and asked quietly, why keep all those weapons instead of destroying them? Martinez looked at her with ancient eyes and said, because forgetting is how you repeat mistakes, and those weapons existed to remind them what they were capable of. And every person who entered the archive of shame saw the cost of unlimited warfare, and it was the best argument for peace they ever met. As Silthara asked what would happen if that argument failed, and Martinez replied, then they would remember they knew how to be monsters and do what was necessary to survive later aboard their ship as it departed Earth's orbit. Prince Terran called them together to discuss their report and asked what they learned about weakness. Sessaneth replied they had no weaknesses in any conventional sense because their technology surpassed elf capabilities, and their industrial capacity exceeded what the Empire had, and their willingness to do terrible things if forced was absolute. Silthar added that they were also broken, and asked if anyone saw the leader's hands when he talked about Beijing, or heard the Admiral's voice describing Memorial Fleet. Because they were traumatized by what they had done, and maybe that was a weakness, I countered that it might be what made them stronger because they remembered the cost, and that made them careful and deliberate and absolutely certain. When they finally did act, he said he would recommend seeking genuine alliance, not friendship based on weakness, but partnership based on mutual respect, because the Empire had magic and dragons and 3 millennia of civilization, while humans had technology and weapons and hard-won wisdom about survival, and together they could be formidable. I've asked what would happen if the Emperor disagreed, and Terran said simply, then they would do their duty and prepare for a war they would lose, but he was hoping the Emperor was wise enough to see what they saw. Silthara stood at the window watching Earth recede with Liren pressed against her, and still unsettled by what they witnessed, and in her mind she kept returning to the archive of shame and the lists of names and weapons kept as reminders rather than tools. Humanity had seen something terrible and chosen to climb out of it, and that was frightening in its own way, because it meant they knew exactly how deep the darkness went, and they could guide anyone else there if forced. She prayed the Aurelies Empire was smart enough not to force them. The journey home took 3 weeks, And during that time, the delegation compiled their reports and analyzed everything they had seen and learned, and Silthera found herself thinking constantly about Kate Morgan. Silthara's blood ran cold at those words because the Creel Consortium was the species that attacked Earth 40 years ago and sparked humanity's transformation into a military power, and they had been scattered and driven back and left alone as a warning, but nothing stayed, gone forever. The display showed intelligence reports with Creel ships gathering at their borders and technology that had advanced significantly since their last encounter with humanity, and most concerning was evidence. They had been watching Earth and the Aurelia's empire and studying and learning about both. Martinez explained that the Creel saw their alliance forming, and they were afraid because a united front of human technology and elf magic was something they could not compete with, so they were going to try to break them apart before the alliance solidifier. Aaron asked how they planned to do this, and Aethera said through his hologram that they would attack the new colony world of Prosperity, which was the Empire's newest settlement with barely any defenses, and it happened to be right on the border of Creel space. He explained they would strike there and kill elf people and dare the Empire to respond, and if the elves fought and lost, it would prove the alliance was weak, and if they asked for help, it would make them look dependent on humanity, and if humans helped without being asked, the Creel would claim humans were conquering by proxy. Martinez admitted it was a clever trap, and whoever designed it understood both civilizations well. Soletta studied the tactical displays and saw Prosperity had minimal defenses with only 3 ships and a handful of orbital platforms, and against a determined Creel assault they would last only minutes. And she asked when the attack would happen. James replied that intelligence suggested within the week, which gave them very little time to decide how to respond. Thuris said he would take his fleet with 20 ships and everything they could spare without leaving other systems vulnerable. But it would not be enough, because the Creel were sending 100 vessels, and they had decided this was worth a major offensive. The room fell silent, and this was the moment that would define whether the alliance was real or just convenient words, and Silthera could see calculation in everyone's eyes, about helping and risking being seen as the dominant partner, or not helping improving the alliance. Mininglaselthar said slowly there was another option, and asked what if they showed the Creel something neither civilization had revealed before. Martinez raised an eyebrow and said she was listing. Zelthar explained that the Creel expected either an elf fleet or a human fleet, or both fighting separately, but what if they faced something new, which was a joint force with ships from both civilizations working as a single, coordinated fleet with human weapons and elf magic supporting them and dragon scouts guiding human fighters. One of Martinez's aides said that was crazy, because they had never trained together and did not know each other's tactics, and their equipment was not compatible and command structures were completely different. Silthar countered that they had 6 days, and she knew people on both sides who had been wanting to try this since the alliance formed, and the question was whether leaders had courage to take the risk. Thoris studied her through the hologram and asked if she would trust human ships to protect an elf colonist. Silthara replied she would trust that humans knew how to fight better than anyone, and she would trust their people to support them in ways no one expected, and together they would be something neither civilization had been before. Terran said quietly it would be a true alliance, not just a treaty, but a unified force. Martinez was already running calculations with her tactical mind, working through logistics, and she said they would need complete transparency and shared command and integrated systems and universal translators, and a week ago she would have said it was impossible, but now she looked at James for his decision. James turned to Atharis and asked for his call, and for a long moment the ancient elf was silent, and then he smiled sharp and dangerous and said they should show the Creel what happens when they threaten their people, meaning all their people, both human and elf. The next 6 days were complete chaos with human and elf crews merging aboard 20 mixed vessels and dragons, training with human fighter pilots to coordinate attacks, and elf mages working with human engineers to integrate magical shields with technological ones in command. Structures being rebuilt to include officers from both species. Siltha commanded a hybrid vessel called Unity that was neither fully elf nor fully human, but something entirely new, and her crew was split evenly between species, with Lyran serving as the ship's living scout and heavy weapons. Platform Admiral Martinez commanded the fleet from the human ship. New Dawn, with Prince Terran serving as political officer and liaison between the two peoples. When they jumped to Prosperity, the Creel were already there, with 100 ships laying siege to the colony, and the 3 elf defense ships were burning wreckage, and the colony's shields were failing, and thousands of people were human colonists living on an elf world, huddled in shelters as bombardment continued. Martinez's voice came through all communications, ordering attack pattern Unity 1 and saying to show the Creel what they had learned. The joint fleet emerged from jump space in a formation no one had seen before, with human ships carrying elf shielding and elf vessels equipped with human weapons, and at the center were dragons carrying human fighter pilots, which was a combination that should not work, but did because both sides chose to trust the Creel fleet, turned to meet them confident in their numbers. Because they had faced humans before and understood their tactics, and they had studied the Aurelia's empire and knew how elf fleets fought, but they had never encountered this new thing. The first wave was pure coordination with human weapons firing, and elf magic bending the trajectories in mid-flight, turning straight line attacks into curving impossibilities in Creel. Ships dodged where shots were supposed to be and died where they actually went. Instead, the second wave was dragon-led, with Lyran and her kind diving through the Creel formation, carrying human fighters on their backs, and the dragons. Natural shields protected the fighters while pilots targeted critical systems with precision strikes, and the Creel had point defense against ships, but not against dragons, though. Third wave was pure overwhelming force, with human relativistic weapons magically accelerated beyond even their normal impossible speeds, striking the Creel command ship, and it simply ceased to exist. And with it, the coordinated Creel defense collapsed. The battle lasted 17 minutes, and when it ended, 60 Creel ships were destroyed, and 30 had surrendered, and 10 had fled, and the joint fleet lost 2 vessels with moderate damage to 3 others, and the colony was saved, and the Alliance had proven itself in fire. But it was in the aftermath that the real story began, because Creel prisoners were taken aboard Unity, and Silthera watched as human and elf crew worked together to provide medical care and process intelligence and treat defeated enemies with dignity, and there was no celebration of victory or gloating over the defeated, but just professional soldiers doing their duty. One Creel captain said to her during an interview that they were different because 40 years ago humans were savage and chased the Creel home and threatened to crack their world, but now they work together. With Elva, Silthera corrected him, saying, now humans chose to work with others, and there was a difference because humanity did not become weak, but became wise. Creel pressed, asking why the Empire made humans equals when they conquered everyone else, and Silthera said quietly, because she saw what humans were capable of and realized conquest was what you did when afraid, while alliance was what you did when confident. And the Aurelia's empire was finally confident enough to have equals too. Months later, Silthera stood in the throne room of the capital once more, but this time she was not alone, because Admiral Martinez stood beside her along with James and 24 human officers, and they were receiving the Star of Unity, which was the Empire's highest honor for Nan-Elves for their role in defending Prosperity. Emperor Atherus descended from his throne to personally present the medals and said 40 years ago, humanity went to war with itself and nearly died, and 3 months ago they came to war with the Empire and showed mercy, and today they stood with the Empire and saved their people, so they had earned more than gratitude, but earned respect. Martinez accepted her medal with quiet dignity and said they did not save the Emperor's people, but saved their people, because that was what this alliance meant, and the Emperor's threats were their threats, and his victories were their victories. James added that their future would be built together, not as human or elf, but as something new. That night Silthera found herself at a celebration aboard New Dawn, which had become a gathering place for both species and neutral ground, where human and elf could meet as equals, and she watched young elf mages teaching human engineers out magical theory, while old elf commanders traded war stories with human veterans. Morgan found her at the observation deck looking out at the stars, and said it was beautiful. With all this cooperation, Siltha corrected her, saying it was terrifying because 6 months ago they were preparing to conquer humans, and now she could not imagine the galaxy without them. Kate said that was the secret, and humanity learned it the hard way that you were stronger with allies than with subjects, because equals pushed.